17 seconds of silence. That was all the drone feed showed before the first T-72B3 rolled out of the tree line. No engine noise on any sensor, no radio call intercepted by a Ukrainian signals unit positioned 4 kilometers west. Just a thermal bloom on a Mavic 3 screen, white-hot against the pre-dawn cold of the Donetsk agricultural plain, and a Ukrainian observer who had been awake for 11 hours, pressing a single button on his tablet to mark the GPS coordinate he had already marked 6 times in the preceding 3 weeks. He already knew the distance. He had measured it himself. The date was early May 2026. The location: the open farmland east of Siversk, a small city in the Donetsk region that sits at the junction of 3 supply axes and has been contested, bombarded, and bled over since the summer of 2022. Russian forces had been probing the eastern approaches for months, looking for a moment of Ukrainian inattention, a gap in observation, a night dark enough to move armor without being seen. They chose a dawn crossing, and the tree line they aimed for had been zeroed for weeks. This is the story of 16 T-72B3 main battle tanks, a battalion-level Russian armored push that was supposed to punch through a thin Ukrainian defensive screen at first light, and the observation network that had already mapped every meter of the route they would take. Over the next 34 minutes, we are going to reconstruct that engagement beat by beat, using geolocated drone footage, wreckage analysis, and the pattern of losses that Ukrainian forces documented in the aftermath. By the end, you will understand not just what happened east of Siversk on that particular morning, but why Russian armored assault doctrine keeps producing the same catastrophic result against a prepared Ukrainian defense, and why it will likely keep doing so. The first question is simple. 16 tanks is not a small force. A battalion-level armored push with that kind of steel at the tip represents a significant commitment of resources that Russia's ground forces, after 4 years of attrition, cannot easily replace. Why did Russian commanders believe this push would succeed? And what exactly had Ukrainian forces done to ensure it would not? To answer that, we need to understand the ground. Siversk sits on elevated terrain above the Siversky Donetsk river valley, and the approaches from the east run across open agricultural land, flat and exposed for stretches of 800 meters to nearly 2 kilometers, depending on which axis you choose. This is tank country in the sense that armor can move quickly across it. It is also precisely the kind of terrain where armor without infantry protection and without suppression of observation posts becomes extraordinarily vulnerable. Every rise in the ground, every isolated copse of trees, every drainage ditch becomes a potential firing position for anti-tank teams. Every clear field of fire cuts both ways. Russian forces had identified a specific approach route that used a section of tree line as staging cover, moving armor from a wooded assembly area through a gap and then across approximately 900 meters of open ground toward a Ukrainian-held position anchored on a second, thinner belt of trees. The idea, as best as Ukrainian intelligence analysts were able to reconstruct it from intercepted communications and subsequent observation, was to push the tanks through quickly at first light, before full visibility, relying on the brief window of low-light conditions to reach the Ukrainian tree line before anti-tank systems could engage effectively at range. Reasonable on paper, failed repeatedly in practice across the entire Donetsk front line, for reasons that should by now be obvious to any Russian operational planner with access to after-action reports. Here is the part that does not make sense on the surface. Russian forces attempting dawn crossings on open terrain in 2026 are doing so with full knowledge that Ukrainian drone coverage of frontline areas is near continuous. The staging area used by this armored group had been under intermittent observation for at minimum 3 weeks before the assault. Reconnaissance drone footage geolocated to the assembly area shows vehicle movement, fuel resupply, and what appears to be a command vehicle visiting the position twice in the 4 days before the push. Ukrainian observers did not need to discover this force on the morning of the attack. They had been watching it prepare. The night before the crossing, a Ukrainian reconnaissance drone, operating at altitude sufficient to avoid detection by the acoustic signature that gives away lower-flying platforms, recorded the staging area in thermal mode. The footage, portions of which were subsequently shared through Ukrainian military channels, shows a cluster of armored vehicles in the tree line, engines cycling as crews prepared their vehicles, and what the Ukrainian unit's after-action summary describes as approximately 16 main battle tanks with associated infantry fighting vehicles and at least 2 logistics vehicles. The composition was consistent with a reinforced tank company or a reduced battalion task group. Ukrainian artillery crews and anti-tank teams used that footage overnight. This is the intelligence dynamic that has defined Ukrainian defensive operations across the Donetsk front, and it is worth understanding in detail because it is the mechanism that turned a 16-tank assault into a catastrophic loss. Pre-registration is an artillery term for the process of calculating firing data for a specific target before the engagement begins, so that when the order to fire comes, the time between order and impact is minimized and the first rounds land accurately. Pre-registration on a fixed point, like a gap in a tree line through which armor must pass, requires knowing the exact coordinates of that point and having those coordinates loaded into the fire control systems of guns and rocket artillery that can range it. Ukrainian forces had done exactly this. The gap in the Russian staging tree line, the open ground across which the tanks would have to move, and the approach to the Ukrainian defensive position had all been measured, mapped, and registered. Forward observers knew the distances. Artillery units had the data. Anti-tank teams were positioned and oriented. What struck the Ukrainian signals team monitoring the area in the hours before the assault was how routine the Russian preparation appeared. Intercepted radio traffic in the hours before the push included what Ukrainian signals analysts described as standard movement orders, confirmation of fuel status, and a brief discussion of timing that referenced first light specifically. There was no indication in the intercepted communications that Russian forces had any awareness their staging area had been under observation. They believed the darkness and the tree cover were protecting them. They were not. Now here is where this story matters beyond the individual engagement. The T-72B3 is not an obsolete tank by Soviet-era standards. It is one of Russia's most common modernization programs for the baseline T-72, incorporating a more powerful engine, an updated fire control system with a thermal sight for the gunner, and a modest upgrade to its reactive armor package. The export and domestic variants differ in specifics, but the version Russia has deployed in largest numbers in Ukraine incorporates Contact 5 explosive reactive armor on the hull and turret, which provides meaningful protection against older anti-tank rounds and some protection against tandem warhead munitions. Against modern anti-tank guided missiles with tandem warheads and against top-attack munitions, it is significantly more vulnerable. Russia had those 16 T-72B3s. Ukraine had pre-registered artillery, positioned anti-tank teams, and continuous drone observation. Here is why that difference determined the outcome before the first tank cleared the tree line. At the moment the lead elements began moving from the staging area, the Ukrainian observation drone was already overhead. The thermal feed showed the column forming, lead tanks moving to the gap, infantry mounting on vehicle hulls as the column prepared to advance at speed. The observer watching the feed had his radio in hand. The call he made was brief. Target, moving armor, reference point November 7, execute. The first artillery rounds were already in the air before the lead tank had traveled 200 meters from the tree line. And here is where it falls apart for the Russian column in a way that is almost mechanically predictable and has been predictable since the earliest weeks of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. The lead tank was struck in the open. The vehicle stopped. Whether the crew was immediately incapacitated or whether the tank was mechanically disabled by the first impact is difficult to determine precisely from drone footage alone, but the vehicle ceased moving and began to emit smoke within seconds of the impact. The column behind it had two choices: stop and present stationary targets in the open, or attempt to maneuver around the disabled lead vehicle and continue the assault. Here is what most people assume about armored assaults: that a well-trained crew can identify the threat, maneuver around a blocked vehicle, and continue the mission under fire. The evidence from 4 years of combat in Ukraine tells a different story. In open terrain, under accurate artillery fire, with drone observation directing adjustments in real time, the ability of following vehicles to maneuver is severely constrained. The agricultural ground east of Siversk is not smooth parade ground terrain. It has drainage features, soft soil in places, and limited room to maneuver wide of a blocked route without exposing flank surfaces to the anti-tank teams positioned to exploit exactly that movement. The second and third tanks in the column slowed as the lead vehicle stopped. This is the moment that drone footage captures with particular clarity in every comparable engagement documented along the Donetsk front. The concertina effect, where following vehicles compress toward the obstacle created by the lead vehicle, bunching the column and creating a target-rich environment for artillery and anti-tank systems that can now engage multiple vehicles with minimal adjustment between shots. Artillery continued to work the open ground. Ukrainian anti-tank teams, positioned in depth behind the Ukrainian Treeline, engaged vehicles that had moved wide of the main axis and were presenting their flanks. The combination of top-attack artillery munitions, direct anti-tank fire, and the disorganizing effect of the lead vehicle blocking the primary route produced a rapid collapse in the column's combat effectiveness. What we know from the drone footage and the subsequent wreckage analysis is that the engagement unfolded in a compressed time frame. This was not a battle that lasted hours. Ukrainian accounts and the physical evidence of where vehicles burned suggest the decisive phase lasted less than 20 minutes from the moment the first tank cleared the tree line to the moment the Russian assault had effectively ceased to function as an organized force. Put yourself in the position of a Russian tank commander in the middle of that column. Your lead elements have stopped. You can see smoke. Your radio is filling with broken transmissions. The ground around you is being struck by artillery that is adjusting in real time based on observation you cannot counter because you have no way to reach the drone overhead. Your options are to push forward into the same fire that has already stopped the lead vehicles, to stop and survive momentarily while presenting a stationary target, or to attempt a reversal and retreat back toward the staging area, exposing your rear armor. None of these options are good. That is the point. A prepared defense with observation, pre-registered fires, and positioned anti-tank systems is not a fair fight. It is not supposed to be. This is the most important thing to understand about the tactical design that Ukrainian forces have developed along the Donetsk front, and we will return to it. But first, let us account for what was left on the field. If this investigation is holding your attention, you already know this channel does this kind of detailed OSINT reconstruction every week. Subscribe now so you do not miss the next one. Wreckage analysis conducted from drone imagery in the hours and days following the engagement allows for a reasonably precise count, though exact numbers are inherently uncertain in any combat assessment and should be treated as estimates rather than definitive figures. Ukrainian military sources and open-source analysts who have examined the available footage identified what appears to be 9 to 11 vehicles that were destroyed or rendered inoperable during the engagement, including at minimum 7 to 8 T-72B3 tanks, with additional vehicles showing damage consistent with being struck but potentially recoverable. For context, 9 destroyed T-72B3 tanks at replacement costs that Russian defense industry is currently struggling to meet represent a significant material loss. The Soviet-era industrial base that produced T-72s in enormous numbers no longer exists in its original form, and while Russia has maintained production capacity and is drawing down its strategic reserve of stored older tanks for refurbishment, each loss is not simply replaced by a phone call to a factory. According to Oryx open-source data, which tracks visually confirmed Russian armored vehicle losses with specific imagery evidence, Russia has lost more than 4,000 tanks of all types since February 2022. The strategic reserve that was supposed to make those losses sustainable is not infinite, and the refurbishment pipeline is producing vehicles at a rate that does not keep pace with losses on the current tempo of operations. What is most surprising about this engagement is not the outcome. It is what the intercepted communications afterward revealed about Russian awareness of what had gone wrong. Ukrainian signals intelligence, which monitors Russian military radio frequencies continuously along the front, captured traffic in the hours following the engagement that Ukrainian sources described as consistent with a unit reporting significant vehicle losses and requesting instructions. What the intercepted traffic reveals, as much as anything, is the gap between what Russian command expected and what happened. The framing of the situation in those communications, as described in Ukrainian military reporting, suggested that the assault force had encountered unexpectedly heavy resistance, a characterization that does not align with the reality that they had driven into a prepared engagement zone that had been ready for them for weeks. The phrase unexpectedly heavy resistance appears in Russian after-action language with enough regularity after failed assaults to constitute a pattern. It is the phrase that gets written when commanders need to explain losses without acknowledging the fundamental problem, which is that Ukrainian observation networks have made surprise essentially impossible for Russian armored formations moving to contact across open terrain. Here is the take that will get some pushback. The failure east of Siversk is not primarily a failure of the tank crews or the infantry accompanying them. The soldiers in those vehicles were doing what they were ordered to do, in a tactical concept that had been developed and approved at levels above them. The failure is doctrinal and institutional, and it belongs to the Russian military planning apparatus that continues to authorize battalion-level armored pushes on pre-observed approach routes against a defense that has demonstrated hundreds of times across 4 years that it can see them coming. That is not a failure of courage or capability at the individual level. It is a failure of the system that sends those individuals into engagements the system has already lost before the first vehicle moves. The broader pattern here is worth examining carefully, because Siversk is not unique. It is one instance of a repeating dynamic that is played out across the Donetsk front, from Bakhmut to Avdiivka to Toretsk, and now here. Russian operational planning appears to be working from an assumption that attrition will eventually exhaust Ukrainian observation capacity, or that mass will eventually overcome preparation. Neither assumption has proven correct at the scale of individual engagements. Ukrainian observation networks on the Donetsk front are layered in a way that is worth understanding. It begins with persistent drone coverage using platforms that range from commercial reconnaissance quadcopters to military-grade fixed-wing systems that can loiter for hours. Those drones feed imagery to analysis teams who maintain constantly updated maps of Russian positions, staging areas, and movement patterns. When a Russian armored formation begins to prepare for an assault, the preparation itself, the vehicle movement, the fuel resupply, the ammunition loading, creates signatures that are visible to observation systems watching specifically for them. The second layer is artillery pre-registration and fire planning. Ukrainian artillery units along the Donetsk front have developed detailed fire plans for the most likely approach routes in their sectors. These are not improvised in the hours before an assault. They represent weeks of preparation, surveying, and calculation. When a Russian column moves along one of those pre-planned routes, the artillery response time is measured in minutes rather than the 15 to 20 minutes that might be required if crews were working out firing data from scratch. The third layer is the anti-tank teams, positioned and oriented toward the specific avenues of approach that observation has identified as most likely. These teams include crew-served systems like the American-supplied TOW and the Ukrainian-manufactured Stugna-P, and man-portable systems including the American Javelin, which uses a fire-and-forget guidance system and a top-attack warhead specifically designed to strike the thinner upper armor of tanks. The combination of these three layers means that a Russian armored formation moving to contact on the Donetsk front is not facing a single defensive system. It is facing a synchronized network, and disrupting one node does not collapse the defense. It is exactly the kind of integrated approach that armored assaults have historically struggled to overcome without either suppressing observation before the attack or finding a route that has not been pre-registered. Russian forces have attempted both. Air-delivered munitions, artillery, and loitering munitions have all been used to attempt to suppress Ukrainian observation posts and drone teams before planned assaults. The results have been mixed at best, because Ukrainian drone teams operate from dispersed positions that are difficult to fully suppress, and because replacing a destroyed drone costs a fraction of what it costs to replace the armored vehicle whose loss the drone will be used to document. One detail that stuck with me when going through the available reporting on this engagement: the Ukrainian observer who initiated the fire call had marked that GPS coordinate 6 times in 3 weeks. 6 times. That is not reactive defense. That is a system that has internalized the patience required to make a prepared engagement work. The understanding that knowing exactly where the enemy will be when they finally move is worth weeks of watching and waiting. Question for anyone following this conflict seriously: how many more battalion-level armored pushes on pre-observed routes does Russian operational planning authorize before doctrine changes at a level high enough to alter the pattern? Comment what you think. The comment section on this one is going to be interesting. The satellite imagery from Maxar and Planet, which provides periodic coverage of the Donetsk front, shows the agricultural approaches east of Siversk in the days following the engagement. The dark marks on the open ground that appear in that imagery are consistent with vehicle fires. They are positioned along the axis that the drone footage from the engagement confirms as the route of advance. They are also concentrated in the open ground between the two tree lines, which is exactly where a column caught by pre-registered fire and anti-tank engagement would be expected to stop. The battle damage assessment conducted by Ukrainian forces in the immediate aftermath and subsequently corroborated by open-source analysts examining the available imagery described the engagement as a significant Ukrainian defensive success. Ukrainian General Staff, reporting on the day following the engagement, referenced armored losses inflicted on Russian forces in the Siversk direction, consistent with the scale of losses documented in the drone footage. Russian state media and military bloggers, monitoring the same general area through different sources, acknowledged vehicle losses in the sector without providing specific numbers, a pattern consistent with significant losses that the information apparatus is not prepared to characterize in detail. The Donetsk front Russian military blogosphere, which often provides more candid assessments of Russian losses than official sources, carried posts in the days following the engagement that described a difficult situation on the Siversk axis without endorsing the official characterization of progress. This is what actually stands out about this engagement when viewed in the broader context of the war. By May 2026, the information environment around Russian armored losses on the Donetsk front has developed its own pattern. Official sources minimize. The millblogger community acknowledges more than official sources, but still frames losses in terms of heroism and continued pressure rather than systemic failure. Open-source analysis, using geolocated drone footage and satellite imagery, provides the most accurate picture, which is consistently worse than either Russian official or semi-official sources acknowledge. The gap between the official narrative and the documented reality has not closed in 4 years. If anything, it has widened. For Ukrainian forces, the lesson of the Siversk engagement is a validation of an approach that has already been validated hundreds of times. Observation, patience, pre-registration, and the integration of artillery with positioned anti-tank teams creates a defensive architecture that is extremely difficult to overcome with the assault methods that Russian forces are employing. The cost to Ukraine in ammunition and drone assets to execute this engagement was a fraction of the material value of the vehicles destroyed. The ratio is not sustainable for Russia at the tempo of operations along the Donetsk front. For Russian forces, the lesson is one that should have been absorbed long ago, but evidently has not been internalized at the operational planning level. Moving armor across open ground against a defense that has had weeks to prepare is not a matter of mass overcoming preparation. It is preparation defeating mass, every time, at a cost ratio that favors the defender so dramatically that continued repetition of the failed method is difficult to explain in purely rational terms. Will Russia change its approach? Partly. Russian forces have shown limited adaptability in some tactical areas, including the increased use of motorcycle-mounted infantry to probe positions before committing armor, and the use of remote-controlled vehicles to attempt to detonate mines and clear paths. But the fundamental operational pattern, massing armor on predictable approach routes and pushing at first light in the hope that speed will compensate for the absence of surprise, has proven resistant to change at the level where change would matter. Looking back at 4 years of documented engagements, the real question is not whether individual Russian commanders understand what is happening to their forces. It is whether the institutional apparatus that generates operational plans is capable of updating its doctrine faster than Ukrainian forces can update their observation networks and fire plans. The evidence so far suggests it cannot. Here is what this pattern tells us about where the Donetsk front goes from here. Siversk is not a unique vulnerability in the Ukrainian defensive architecture. Every sector of the front has similar geography, similar observation networks, and similar pre-registration. Russian forces pressing on Donetsk, on Pokrovsk, on Kostiantynivka face the same conditions. Open approaches, persistent drone coverage, and defenders who have had months to prepare the ground. The tactical logic that produced the outcome east of Siversk applies across the front. The engagement also validates the investment Ukraine has made in drone observation capacity. The drone operators and analysts who tracked the Russian staging area for 3 weeks before the assault are not a special elite capability. They represent the normalized practice of Ukrainian frontline units who have built this observation methodology into standard operating procedure. A $400 reconnaissance drone, operated by a trained observer with the discipline to watch and wait, multiplies the effectiveness of every artillery round and every anti-tank missile that follows its observation. If you have been following this war seriously for any length of time, you know that this dynamic has been visible since at least the summer of 2022. When Ukrainian forces first began demonstrating that HIMARS-enabled precision artillery, guided by continuous observation, could systematically degrade Russian logistics and command infrastructure far behind the front line. What has developed since then is the application of the same observational discipline at the tactical level, turning every approach route into a potential engagement zone that has already been prepared before the enemy arrives. The 15 seconds between the moment the Ukrainian observer's tablet registered the thermal bloom of the first T-72B3 moving from the staging Treeline and the moment he pressed the radio transmit button were not 15 seconds of decision. The decision had been made 3 weeks earlier, when the first observation drone marked the staging area and the first artillery crew received the coordinate for pre-registration. Those 15 seconds were simply the moment when a prepared system executed a prepared plan. And the 9 burning hulls that the satellite imagery shows on the agricultural ground east of Siversk are the result. 3 questions worth sitting with as this one closes. Could Russia have prevented this outcome if it had maintained stricter radio discipline and avoided staging in an area under observation for 3 weeks? The honest answer is that stricter radio discipline and better counter-drone measures would complicate Ukrainian observation, but they cannot make an armored formation invisible to persistent aerial coverage across open terrain. The physics of thermal observation and the density of Ukrainian drone coverage on the Donetsk front set a floor on what is achievable. How does this pattern change the calculus for NATO allies thinking about armored warfare doctrine in a potential conflict with Russia? The Siversk engagement, like Avdiivka and Bakhmut before it, provides a data set on how Russian armored forces perform against a prepared defense with modern observation and precision fires. That data set is available to every NATO planning staff. The implications for how to structure a defensive operation against Russian armor are significant and are being studied. And the final question, what is the next Russian operational concept on the Donetsk front, and will Ukrainian observation networks be watching it develop the same way they watched the 16 tanks staging east of Siversk? The probability, based on 4 years of evidence, is yes. Subscribe to Frontline Truth for weekly OSINT reconstructions of the engagements that are actually shaping this war. We do the detailed work, so you have the full picture.